Feel like it was sometime early December, maybe even not even then, when I was teaching last. So I don't know. We're back in Matthew though, and picking right back up where we left off. As I've said, we're in section 4 of Matthew, which is from about chapter 12, verse 38, through chapter 16, verse 20. So about 4 chapters, and I've titled that, Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn, because I think those two ideas run throughout pretty much this whole portion of Matthew. That's why I've made it its own section. That's part of the reason that I've made it its own section. And in that 4th section, we're still in the very first main block of it, which is chapter 13 and the kingdom parables, or as I've called them, the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom. They fill most of chapter 13, and we've been slowly working through that, but have not yet actually come to any parables. We've been talking a lot about the concept of a parable and some things Jesus says here at the beginning, but have yet to actually move through a particular parable in this section. And tonight we're going to start that finally with the parable of the sower. And so we need to read 2 passages actually, both of them here at the front of chapter 13. First the parable and then the interpretation that Jesus gives. So just start in 13:1. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered around him, so that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. And other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. And then we can skip down to verse 18, where Jesus actually interprets this parable for his disciples. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. I've decided to discuss this parable in 2 messages rather than 1. And the first message will focus on the sower, and the second message will focus on the soils of the parable. So we're dividing them in 2 messages, and today's message, the first one, is going to focus on the sower. Now I consider it justifiable to spend a whole message on just the sower, and the theme is more closely associated with his character in the parable. First of all, if you didn't notice, Jesus actually calls the parable of the sower. So the sower is the title character. He's the main character, and so obviously he's important. So Jesus, I guess, would like to focus our attention on him at least a little bit. Now it's easy to get distracted by the 4 soils and their crops, because after all, the descriptions of those soils and crops gets a lot of attention, and most people do focus on those things. But I want to give a whole message on just the sower, so that your mind is in what I think is a more correct place as we begin to study the parable. So, one whole message on the sower, and I'm calling this message the secret of the sower, and I have 3 points that'll be my outline. The first is the surprising success of the sower. The second is the secret identity of the sower, and then the third is the kingdom symbolized by the sower. So those are the 3 main points through which we'll be moving as we go through this parable. Now, as I often do, I want to give you a question that will occupy your mind during the message, just something to keep you focused on why this even matters and what we're trying to learn from this. And the question that I want you to be asking yourself is, what will Jesus do about his failing kingdom? Just assessing the situation here and now at this point in Matthew, the question is, what will Jesus do about his failing kingdom? We've followed the ministry of Jesus for 9 chapters of Matthew now. So we've seen a lot of what he's been doing. And he has so far alienated himself from the leaders of the Jews. He's not very popular with them. The crowds, meanwhile, are rather fickle. They're still following him around, but it's very clear that their interest is primarily in just the sensationalism of a prophet healer wandering around. So Jesus only really has a very small group of committed followers, those people we call the disciples, namely the 12 disciples, which isn't really much of a kingdom. The situation looks kind of grim, looks very unpromising. So how do we move from that bleak situation to the great and glorious kingdom of God? We know Jesus is the Messiah, and we know he is bringing in the kingdom, yet somehow it looks like things have stalled. How are we going to get from where we are now to that point? Now, I think Jesus provides an answer to that question with the parable of the sower. He's actually trying to answer this question that I want you to keep in your mind as we go through the message. So that's sort of the why bother of studying the parable of the sower. So let's begin answering that question with my first main point here, which is the main plot of the parable. As I identified, the main plot of the parable is the surprising success of the sower. That's what I would identify as the main storyline of this story. And I'll begin that with a rather rosy point that the sower in the parable seems to be a complete fool. Right? When you really look at his actions and what he's doing and think about them, you seem to be dealing with a man that does not appear very intelligent, or at least not very good at his trade of farming. I'd like you to think for a moment as though you were a farmer. I know most people in our society anymore, the farmers are what you drive by, maybe if you live in the right part of the nation, as you're going to your actual job, which has nothing to do with agriculture. So you probably don't know much about farming, but just imagine for a moment that you were a farmer. In ancient times, you would probably have to spread your seed by hand, which is sowing. The whole idea of sowing is just out there scattering seed. And you were probably, as an ancient farmer, born on a farm, raised on a farm, and employed on a farm all your life. So from day one of your life until the day you die, your life is farming. So you know how plants work, right? You understand what it means to plant something, help it grow, harvest it. You understand that whole process. And you know that plants do not grow on roads. So you will not be sowing any seeds on the road that runs by your field, because that would be pointless. They don't grow there. The soil's too hard. It won't work. You also know that plants do not grow on rocks. So if you're out there in your field sowing your seed and you see a bunch of rocky land, you're not going to sow any seed there because you know plants do not grow there. And finally, you know that plants do not grow where other plants are already growing. There's only so much nutrient in the soil to help it grow. So if you see a bunch of thorn bushes on your field, you're not going to be throwing any seeds there either. Now, if you yourself were a farmer, you would understand all of that. That would be the kind of thing you learned when you were a very young child, following your father around as he was working on the farm. Now, this sower in the parable does not seem to understand Farming 101. He was absent the whole time, in farming school or whatever, learning these things. He just wasn't there. He wasn't paying attention. This sower does not understand anything. This sower has decided to waste perfectly good seed by sowing in places where no seed could ever grow. On a roadway, in thorn bushes, on rocks. He's sowing in all these places where nothing would ever grow. Oh, sure, he gets some on the good soil there at the very end. He actually gets his aim right and, perhaps by mere luck, manages to hit a good spot. But you get the impression that 75% of his seed is going to complete waste, that he's not going to accomplish anything by his labor in all of his sowing. So this sower has spent most of his day sowing in the wrong places. It doesn't seem like a very bright farmer. And I've said that the purpose of a parable is to capture attention and provoke thought. That was the main defining trait that I gave you for what a parable is at the beginning of this series. And I would say that the image of an incompetent farmer certainly does both. Jesus is probably teaching to a crowd of people that are mainly farmers. Again, they know all the things you're supposed to do on a farm, and they hear this story about a guy who knows nothing about farming. They're probably somewhat interested, at least by the strangeness of this story, and this sower who seems to be a complete fool at what he's doing. So you have there, that's our main character. The main character of this parable is a foolish farmer. And yet, surprisingly, after all that, this sower has tremendous success at what he is doing. He actually abounds in his task. And I'm, of course, referring to that fourth group of seeds there at the very end on the fourth soil. Verse 8, other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And based on that verse, I say that this sower had tremendous success. In fact, I would say he was so successful in his farming that year that the only explanation is that he was blessed by God. And I want to make that argument here for a little bit, that specifically this is a divine blessing, what the farmer has here in front of him. Scholars have long debated about the usual crop yields of Palestinian farms. Sounds like a very dry topic, but the reason they debate those things is because they want to know just how profitable is this man's harvest here at the very end, where you have some of these seeds bearing 30, 60, and 100-fold. Is that normal? Is that above average? Is that below average? They spend a lot of time discussing this, and frankly, there's a lot about it that is not very clear. I mean, you're dealing with how farms were done 2,000 years ago. There's just a lot you can't know. But we can say with some degree of certainty that some of these seeds were divinely fruitful, meaning to say that God blessed these seeds and made them more abundant in their harvest than normal. And we're getting that from Genesis chapter 26, where we have a farming reference that might be helpful for understanding just how much an ancient farmer could squeeze out of his farm. Genesis 26, verses 12 through 13. This is the story of Isaac. Genesis 26, verse 12. And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. You see that reference there, that Isaac, this year that he farmed, he reaped 100-fold from what he was farming, and the commentary on that is that God blessed him and made him very mighty. So apparently, if you sow and reap 100-fold, that is such wealth that it's a sign of God's blessing. That is a mega harvest there. If you have seeds that are bearing that much fruit, God is with your farm. Now, we can't say too much more about the 30-fold and the 60-fold. We don't have a lot of data on what those would be. We could probably guess that maybe 30-fold is at least average and 60 is pretty darn good. But when you get to the 100-fold, that's a sign that God is with you. So God at least has his eye on at least some of these plants, making them grow, making them abound, in spite of the fact that the farmer doesn't seem to know what he's doing. That's the general image here, that this sower, though he seems to be a fool, is a tremendous success because God was blessing him. Now, I want you to think of that as the main plot of the parable. When you think of what is mainly happening here in terms of the surface level story, the main plot is that farmer's tremendous success. I want you to think about this according to the rules for interpretation that I laid out for you when we discussed how to read story parables and profit from them. First of all, one of the things I told you was that you're supposed to look for a surprising element. You're supposed to look for a surprise in the parable because very often Jesus uses those surprises to teach. Now, if you saw a farmer sowing on roads, rocks, and thorns, you'd be very surprised at that because, again, usually farmers know what they're doing. They know that you're not supposed to throw seed on those places. So if you saw that, you'd be very shocked. And you'd probably be even more surprised to learn on top of that God had blessed that farmer. That guy out there who is not worth the land he has, not worth the seed he has, is actually being blessed by God in his efforts. That whole continuum of thought here, from the farmer's bad job to God's great blessing, that whole thing is going to be surprising to you as you're listening to this parable. So the surprise here does not really lie in the seeds or the soils so much. I mean, you know that rocky soil is going to bear bad crop. I mean, you know that. You know that thorny soil is going to do the same thing. You expect all of that. What you don't expect is for a farmer like this to have some kind of divine blessing operating on his farm. So you see the surprising element there. The surprising element follows what I believe to be the main plot of the parable. Another thing is you're supposed to look to the ending of the parable, right? Because I told you that usually in a story, the author will put his main point at the end because that's where the emphasis falls, and that the story parables of Jesus are no different. He usually puts his main point at the very end. Well, here in this parable, I think you see that. The whole story prepares us for the failure of the sower. As you're at the beginning of the story, you see him sowing his seed in all these terrible places. You're expecting him to fail. You're expecting him to have not much to show for all his hard work that season. But the last thing we see in the parable is the flourishing of his crops. In fact, a divine blessing on his crops. And that's what happens at the end of the parable. That's where the stress of the story falls on his success. So not only is the contrast very strong between his foolishness and his fruitfulness, but also at the very ending you have that emphasis on the last part of that, the divine blessing that is on his field. So the important point is not the failure of the sower in the first three kinds of seeds, but the success of the sower in his fourth seed, because it comes at the end of the parable. So if you look to the ending of the parable, you discover that the surprising success of the sower is probably the main plot of this parable. That's my way of working that out based on the principles that I showed you at the beginning of this whole series. So just following the rules I laid down, that's where I get this idea that the main plot is the surprising success of the sower. Now, what I want to do is I want to carry that idea into my second main point here. And the second main point is the secret identity of the sower. And I've called it that because I really think there is a kind of secret identity working itself out here in this passage. I refer to the sower's secret identity because Jesus seems to keep it a secret. He doesn't come out and tell you who the sower is or what he represents. It's kind of a secret identity. Now, when most Christians read the parable of the sower, they immediately get the impression that the sower is a Christian evangelizing. That is pretty much the way I have heard the parable taught up until my study of this passage for this series. That's generally what I hear. That's generally what I hear people say. They read the parable and they say, okay, it's a Christian evangelizing. And it's the effects of evangelism and how uneven they are, and things of that sort. I would like to suggest that if you read the parable that way, then you have fallen victim to the parables of Jesus. I remember telling you that these parables are very riddlesome in their nature. They're not meant to be understood by just anyone. They are meant to conceal truth in some way. If you read the parable and you say, okay, it's a Christian evangelizing, I think you've fallen into the trap. I think Jesus has misdirected you on purpose, of course, because that's the point of these parables. I think he has successfully misdirected you away from what you were supposed to be seeing. And until I began studying this passage, I didn't see that either. So don't feel bad if by the end of this message you're like, oh man, why'd I never read it that way? Well, I didn't either, so it's okay. But I want to give you a different way of reading the parable here. And just remember, again, as I tell you this, that Jesus tells these parables to reveal and conceal truth at the same time. He's doing both. He's concealing the truth from the crowds so that most people don't get it, but also revealing the truth in such a way that those who are committed to his teaching will get it. So just remember that. That's the core idea that he lays out here as he's talking with his disciples about who's going to understand these parables and who won't. So remember that as we talked about the parable of the sower and as we try to figure it out. There are going to be things here that are concealing truth that you have to break through because you are a committed disciple of Jesus. You have spiritual understanding. You have the effort that you want to make. You're the one that can understand this, but you got to try hard at it. Now, enough mystery here. I just want to tell you exactly what I think. I do not think that the sower in this parable is a Christian. Not at all. I have abandoned that idea. I'm pretty confident that the sower in the parable is not a Christian. I rather think that the sower in the parable is Jesus Christ himself. Not just Christians in general as they evangelize, but Christ himself as he evangelizes. That's what I think, and I think the parable is about his ministry 2,000 years ago. Not the ministry of every Christian, but Jesus' ministry in particular. I was surprised when I began studying this passage that every single one of my commentators took this position, because I never even heard of it before, and it certainly didn't occur to me as I was reading the passage, but the more they wrote about it, the more I saw that makes a lot of sense. And that's the kind of stuff I want to share with you in this second point here, about why the secret identity of the sower is Jesus. Now, before proving that, I want to make myself clear, just so there's no misunderstanding, or I don't want you to get the impression you have to throw everything out you've ever heard about this parable. I do believe that the sower is Jesus and only Jesus. I think he is the specific referent of the sower in the parable. And if I am right, then Jesus uses this parable to make a statement about his own evangelistic efforts. It's about his evangelism, not necessarily the evangelism of every single Christian that has ever lived. Now, I am sure that Christians would like to apply the teachings of this parable to their own evangelism. I think it happens very naturally. That's probably why when we read the parable, we think, oh, it's a Christian, because it seems so much like things that we experience. So that makes sense, and I think you can do that. I think if you want to apply lessons from the parable of the sower to your own evangelistic efforts, you can do that. But my rule on this is the same rule I have for any passage of the Bible. You have to apply the lessons of the passage through the original intention of that passage. And the original intention of this passage is to discuss the ministry of Christ. Now, if you see similarities between what Jesus was doing and what you're doing as a Christian, then there's application there. That makes sense. But you have to apply it through Jesus first. So just to clarify that, just simple Bible application rules. Be sure to understand the meaning of the passage first, and then apply it as the original author would have applied it. And I think here the application to Christians is going to be indirect, because Jesus is the actual theme of this parable. Now, in arguing my point that Jesus is the sower, let's do a comparison. In case you're skeptical, let's just weigh things here for a moment. Let's assume that you want to prove that the sower is every Christian, that the sower represents the Christian as he evangelizes. If you want to prove that, you would need to list the arguments that you can make. You should list them out. Okay, here's point 1, point 2, point 3. However many points you can get to prove your argument, you have to do that. Now the problem is, as I began thinking about this, in light of what all my commentators were saying, I could only think of one real reason to take the parable as describing a Christian, that the sower is a Christian. And that one reason is simply that the sower preaches the gospel with various results, as do Christians. And we know that, of course. Anytime you've ever evangelized, sometimes the result is completely different. I mean, that corresponds to your life. So you have one argument that you can make. One argument, which I admit is a good argument. My problem is not with the logic of that argument itself. My point here is that you only have one argument. As I started thinking about how I would argue that the sower is Jesus, I discovered that we can make 5 arguments. 5 really good arguments, in fact. So just stacking the odds here, you have one argument that the sower is a Christian, and I think 5 arguments that the sower is actually Jesus. Which you got to admit, that would create a tremendous amount of weight on one side of the table here. Now, I'm sure you want to hear those arguments, so I'm going to make them. So here we go. 5 arguments that Jesus is the sower in the parable of the sower. Argument number 1. The parable perfectly describes the ministry of Jesus. There is a one-to-one correlation here between what is described in the parable and what is described in the whole gospel about the ministry of Christ. The sower spent most of his efforts sowing seed where it could not grow, right? Rocks, thorns, roads. Spent most of his time sowing seed where there was no way anything could grow. And yet he still had a harvest blessed by God. He still had some of his plants that were bearing fruit 100-fold, and it was a great harvest. Okay, Jesus spent most of his ministry preaching to people who could not understand him. Right? He says specifically at the beginning of chapter 13 here that these crowds, most of these people, they don't have the spiritual understanding to get what he's saying. He makes that very clear. And he's telling parables so that they won't get any more understanding. I mean, he's just very clear here that it's, in a sense, a waste of time to preach to these people. And yet he's still doing it. He's still doing it. And you would think, well, that's kind of silly. Why would you do that? That's not going to be successful. That's not a good, ministry method or whatever term you want to use. And yet, Jesus still has such an impact that he must have been blessed by God. Do you deny that? Christians sitting here 2,000 years from that point, that Jesus had such a ministry that he must have been blessed by God. Same exact story as the sower. I mean, it fits. It's a one-to-one correlation. The parable perfectly describes the ministry of Jesus. That's argument number 1. Argument number 2. If Jesus is the sower, then the parable fits the interruption that we have between the parable and the interpretation, which I skipped over as we read it earlier because I wanted to save time. But you remember that this parable and its interpretation are separated by this discussion, excuse me, where the disciples come to Jesus and say, why do you speak to them in parables? And he gives them an explanation. Now, I argued in an earlier message that the parable and the interpretation are linked by similar words and themes, namely spiritual understanding. That's the main theme of the interrupting discussion. It's also a main theme in the parable of the sower. There's a link there between what's going on in all three of these passages, and I spent some time describing that. Now, in that interruption, the point is that most people do not understand the teaching of Jesus while the disciples do. That's the chief point. The crowds out there, they don't understand. They don't understand, but you disciples, you do understand. Now let's assume that I am correct in saying that Jesus is the sower. Just assume that for the sake of argument. The point of the parable would therefore be that most people do not understand Jesus' teaching while some do. Because that's what you see in the parable. Most people, represented by these soils, nothing. Nothing comes out of them. But a small amount of that seed, that bears fruit. Again, the same exact thing. It would match the interrupting discussion here that is very much linked to this parable and its interpretation. So that's argument number 2. It fits, if you want to say, the whole context. It fits the whole context, including that interruption between the parable and its interpretation. Okay, argument number 3 is that Matthew's wording links the sower to Jesus. Now this would be a very subtle argument. It's an argument based on just the repetition of a phrase, actually, but I think it's worth mentioning. So here we go. Let's read a few phrases here, and the key phrase here is "went out." Okay, verse 1, chapter 13, verse 1. We're going to read through verse 3, and I want you to listen to what I'm saying here. That day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, a sower went out to sow. There in the first 3 verses, Matthew uses the same phraseology for Jesus going out as the sower going out. So you have there a verbal link. Again, that's a very subtle argument, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it does leap out at you once you see it. Okay, argument number 4 is that if Jesus is the sower, then the parable matches the parable of the mustard seed later on in this collection of parables. Now, my assumption is that it is helpful to try to interpret these parables according to one another. You know, they're all going on the same theme of the kingdom, right? Okay, so it would help to take one parable and maybe use it to help you understand another parable if you get stuck. So that's what I'm doing here with the parable of the mustard seed. Now, the parable of the mustard seed later on says this, verse 31. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Now, in that parable, we have a contrast between the kingdom's obscure beginnings and its eventual success. It starts off as a seed that is smaller than any other seed, and then becomes this great tree. So you have this contrast between the obscure beginnings of the kingdom and the eventual success of the kingdom. Now that obscure beginning, of course, is the ministry of Jesus. You know, just this wandering teacher out there, not many committed followers, got killed by the powers that be, you know, kind of obscure, not very grand. But of course, the eventual success came after his ministry when the kingdom of God spread throughout the entire world through the preaching of his disciples. So you have that contrast there in the parable of the mustard seed. In the same way, the sower's efforts seem fruitless at first, but become very fruitful. At first, he's out there sowing his seed, all these places where nothing's going to grow. But then, you know, those crops that he sows on the good soil, they just splurge forth in this great abundant harvest. So again, you have this contrast between a bad beginning and a good ending, just like in the parable of the mustard seed. And of course, again, the parable of the mustard seed begins with the mustard seed, the ministry of Christ. So again, over here in the parable of the sower, it would begin with Jesus. So Jesus would be the sower. That's my logic there for comparing to the parable of the mustard seed. And that's argument number 4. Now my 5th argument is possibly the strongest, so I save it here toward the end, and that is that Jesus portrays himself as a sower in 2 other parables. In this same collection of parables, in 2 other parables, he portrays himself as a sower. The first one is the parable of the weeds. We won't read all of it, but chapter 13, verse 24, we see he put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." Okay, interpretation, verse 37. He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man," which of course is Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. He is the Son of Man. So you see in the parable of the weeds, Jesus refers to himself as a sower. Now the other parable is in this same collection, it's just that Matthew himself did not record it. Mark recorded it, however, so we're going to go to Mark for a little bit. I consider this fair because it's the same set of parables, it's just the different gospel authors choosing what they want to include and what they don't want to include. Mark chapter 4 is where this is. I call this the parable of the harvest. Chapter 4, verse 26, we see this. "The kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows. He knows not how. The earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, and then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts forth the sickle, because the harvest has come." Now, there you have, again, this kind of farm analogy being used to describe the kingdom of heaven. Now, the sower, you'll notice, is the same man as the reaper. The man goes out there and scatters seeds, and then eventually he himself puts in the sickle and reaps. Now, I'm assuming you're going to understand Jesus as being the one who reaps, right? The harvest of the earth is ripe. I mean, that imagery is often used of Christ. He's the one who harvests the earth. So if Jesus is the one harvesting, the one reaping, and if the man who does the reaping is the man who does the sowing, it seems like the guy out there sowing seed is again Jesus. So we have a second parable where Jesus is the sower. That one's not as plain as the parable of the weeds, but I think it is there. So on two different occasions, two other parables in this same collection, Jesus portrays himself as a sower. Now, it is possible that Jesus might use that figure of speech for someone other than him. I'm not going to say it's a hard line kind of thing, but these three parables are very similar in their images and very similar in their themes. They cover a lot of the same ground. I would be very surprised if the sower in one were different than in the two others. I just think, to me, this is a very strong argument that Jesus himself is the sower. And for those 5 reasons, I have come to fully believe that Jesus himself is the sower in the parable of the sower. I no longer really give much credence to the idea that the sower is a Christian. So that's why I think what I think. Now, I would like to make one quick note about a possible objection to this view, because I did sit down and think to myself, okay, before we get carried away here, let's see, is there anything against this view that I need to know about? And I did think of one objection, but I don't think it's very strong. I'll just go ahead and deal with it briefly. You'll notice in the parable of the sower that the second category of person, represented by that second soil, is a person who falls away because of persecution, right? I mean, he sowed on the rocky soil, and it comes up quickly, but because it has no root, it withers away when the sun comes up and scorches it. And he says these are those who fall away from persecution. Okay, so you might think, and I thought so at first too, that a comment about persecution causing apostasy would be out of place in a description of the ministry of Jesus, right? Because during the ministry of Jesus, you don't think about a lot of persecution going on. I mean, I don't. I don't think of persecution as something that happened during the ministry of Christ, except to Jesus himself, of course, because he was eventually executed. Usually you think of persecution as something that came after the ministry of Jesus. So you might think, well, the sower parable must be about after the ministry of Jesus, because we have persecution. Well, don't be so fast about that, because there actually was persecution in the time of Jesus. And if you go to John's Gospel, chapter 9, you'll see a reference to it. This is in the account of healing the man born blind, John chapter 9, verse 20. This is the part where they kind of have this formerly blind man on trial, and they don't like the fact that Jesus healed him, so they're trying to get away from that observation that Jesus healed this guy. And they brought in the guy's parents, if you'll remember. His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. So already, if you're a follower of Jesus, the Jews are kicking you out of the synagogue, which basically means you're disfellowshipped, you're not considered a pious Jew anymore. And that's such a heavy thing that these parents basically threw their child to the wolves. You get that, right? I mean, there they are with their son, and they're not going to stick up for him and defend him here. I mean, they're just going to say, ask him. We don't want anything to do with this. I mean, that's heavy persecution going on. So there was persecution during the ministry of Jesus. So you could feasibly apply this analogy here of the second soil to something happening within the ministry of Christ. That was the one objection I could think of to this view, and again, I don't think it really works. So again, I'm pretty well convinced that the sower is Jesus Christ himself in the parable of the sower. Now again, the point is not to rob you of a passage relevant for evangelism. That's not what I'm trying to do here at all. I'm just trying to be accurate to the meaning of the passage. I still think you can apply it to your evangelism indirectly, so long as you can find similarities between your evangelism and Jesus' evangelism. And if you wonder how that works, that's what next time's message is for. Whenever I teach next and talk about the soils, I think you'll see a lot of those comparisons. But my point right now is, looking at the meaning of the parable as Jesus intended it, I think he is the sower. Now, let's bring all this together for my third and final point about the kingdom symbolized by the sower. Now, this collection of parables represents Matthew's fullest commentary on the nature of the kingdom of heaven. I gave you all those statistics about word usage and all the other observations about the passage to show you that if you want Matthew's view of the kingdom of heaven, you come to chapter 13 of his gospel. That's where you come. Because every single one of these parables is about the kingdom, and he never teaches about the kingdom with any more intensity than he does here. So this is Matthew's fullest commentary on the kingdom of heaven. Now the sower sows the word of the kingdom. The message that he's out there preaching is the word of the kingdom. So we need to ask what we can learn about the kingdom of heaven from this parable. If we don't do that, we have not gone as far as Jesus wants us to go here. Now I have three observations that I think will be helpful for bringing out what this parable can teach us about the kingdom of heaven. And these observations bring us back to the question I asked you at the beginning, which was, what will Jesus do about his failing kingdom? Hopefully you've been thinking about that this whole time, and you're now ready to hear the answers to that question. And that's what my three observations will do, hopefully. First observation is that the king looks like a failed king. Let's just affirm that fact here, that the man who represents the headship of this kingdom doesn't appear to be doing a very good job at this time. The parable depicts a man sowing seed, mostly in the wrong places, mostly doing no good. That is the general idea of the sower in the parable of the sower. And this parable is a self-portrait of Jesus Christ. This is how Jesus thinks about his ministry. If he is indeed that sower, this is how Jesus thinks about himself. So in his own parable, he makes himself look rather useless. That is his self-portrait that he puts forth to anyone who can understand what he's talking about. So imagine Jesus preaching to those crowds. And you can see this. Over here you have the Pharisees, right? They kind of follow Jesus around and dog his steps so they can argue with him as often as possible. They are so blinded by their legalism, their hypocrisy, and their envy that they don't care at all about what Jesus is saying, right? All they want is, reasons to hate him more and things that they might be able to use against him. That's the only reason they're there listening to him. And then over there you have another group of people. This group of people is so excited about this prophet healer who might be the Messiah. They heard about this man Jesus and these wonderful things that he does and these things that he says, and they want to go see him. And they're really excited about this. That said, the moment they hear that the Pharisees are going to put them out of the synagogue for following Jesus, they're gone. They're back home on their own farms, taking care of their own families. They're not going to deal with Jesus any longer once there's a risk involved. So they're just going to move on to the next prophet healer whenever he shows up, because after all, they're all the same, right? I mean, just another guy going around teaching, doing miracles. Why bother choosing just one? And finally, you have another group of people saying things like, oh, I'd love to follow Jesus, but I'd be worse off than a fox or a bird. You know, a fox or a bird has a place to lay his head, but you follow Jesus around, you're sleeping in the dirt every night. I can't do that. Or what if my father dies? You know, you have men coming up to Jesus saying, let me first bury my father. And he says no, and they can't handle that. I mean, you have people like that who have this kind of shallow idea about following Jesus, but they're not really willing to go and do it. You know, there's too much of a risk there. And that's most of the audience. As Jesus looks out on those crowds, most people fall in one of those three categories. And that's what Jesus is doing with his time. When you think about it, Jesus really was like a sower scattering seed where it could never grow. Never, ever grow. That's what Jesus was doing with most of his time during his ministry. And that is what the king is like. That is the king of this kingdom that has finally arrived after many centuries of expectation. That's what your king is doing. And the great question is, how is he going to establish a kingdom when so few people are listening? Where is he going to get followers if no one can hear him? What's he going to do? How will the kingdom be established if the king looks like a failing king? Well, that brings me to my second observation, and that is this, that Jesus actually succeeded in revealing and concealing his kingdom at the same time. The parable of the sower and all the parables, and his whole ministry for that fact, is actually a resounding success because he did exactly what he was trying to do to begin with, which was both conceal and reveal who he was and what he was doing. We have a saying about hiding in plain sight, right? Something that's just out there in the open, but because you're looking in all the little crevices and all the secret compartments, you don't see what's there, just because you're not looking in the right spot. It's hiding in plain sight. Jesus is the master of hiding in plain sight. He's a man that was out there for everyone to see, and yet no one saw him. No one saw who he actually was. Jesus has said that the kingdom of heaven is a secret. He calls them the mysteries of the kingdom, the secrets of the kingdom, here in chapter 13. He was being modest because in reality, the kingdom of heaven is the best guarded secret in the history of the world. I say that because, on the one hand, it's a very public thing that has come with just obvious notoriety, and yet no one really got it. Jesus had one of the most sensational public careers in the history of the world. I mean, everyone in Palestine knew his name. Huge crowds were following him for a while. I mean, that's big. I mean, most people don't get that, okay? While maintaining that public career, he also maintained the secrecy of his identity and his mission. By the end of that 3 years of ministry, most people were like, oh, I guess he wasn't the Messiah after all. I mean, he successfully kept secret who he was. At the end of that ministry, it was as though nothing happened. How many people do you know who can do both those things at once? Have a very public career in which everyone sees the things they do, hear the things they say, and yet comes away with no understanding of who or what you are. I mean, some people get something at least, but these people, they hear Jesus, and it's just like nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's almost like Bruce Wayne keeping his identity secret as Batman, right? I mean, total secret, but here's the difference. Bruce Wayne doesn't call a press conference and say, I am Batman. He never does that. Jesus gets up here in front of these people, all the things he says and does, screams Messiah, and yet they're like, well, maybe not. You know, is this man the son of David? No, I don't think so. That's their conclusion. He reveals his kingship with the utmost authority, and yet nobody gets it. Here's another point. Think of it this way. You know, most Jews at that time were awaiting the coming of the Messiah. I mean, that's what they wanted. There were some Jews that were the exceptions of that rule. But most Jews, you ask them what they want the Messiah to come, bring the kingdom of heaven, establish their nation, and give them peace. That's what they want. That's the big expectation. Okay, they're waiting for it, they're waiting for it, they're waiting for it, it comes, they miss it, and they're still waiting for it. It came and went, gone. I mean, they had their chance to see it, they just didn't get it. It's like the police waiting in ambush for a criminal, and the criminal gets in, does the job, and gets out, and the police are like, well, when's he going to show up? That's what happens with Jesus' ministry here. What appears to be the world's least effective preacher is actually the world's greatest master of disguise. He was out there teaching plainly, and yet no one got it. I mean, he's out there revealing and concealing his kingdom at once. I mean, that's what he did. Now, you might say, okay, that is impressive. I mean, I couldn't do that. But still, shouldn't a king be regarded as a king? I mean, the king shouldn't be held secret forever, right? The kingdom of God is supposed to be this great thing. Surely there has to be a time where it is publicly acknowledged that the kingdom of God has come and has come with power. Well, that brings me to my last observation, which I hope will fully answer our question, and that is, the king has had his public victory. Jesus did in fact have his time when the secret was out and what was once hidden was then being screamed from the rooftops. Do not forget that in all this secrecy, Jesus is revealing his identity to a very small group, the disciples. To him, he might tell these parables to a crowd with the assumption that they're not going to get it. Well, then he takes the disciples aside and makes sure they understand it. And if they don't get it, he interprets it for them. I mean, he is really opening himself up to these men, this very small group. He is revealing himself fully to the disciples. Now, that group is portrayed in the parable as the ultra-productive fourth soil, as this divinely blessed harvest that is so much more than what a normal farmer could get. That's who the disciples are in all this. So let's add to the parable. Let's add some neighbors watching that sower at work, okay? Watching this guy out there sowing his seed in all these ridiculous places. They're going to think he's crazy, that he's lost his mind sowing where he's sowing. Well, then when the harvest comes, those neighbors are going to realize that he is the most blessed farmer in the whole country because no one has the results this guy has. No one else does. They're going to see that. They didn't see it at first, but they're going to see it when harvest comes around. And so it has been with Jesus. So it will be for him in the future. The disciples were productive, right? I mean, after Jesus leaves, ascends back to the Father, he sends them out to all the different nations of the world, and that's when the word of Jesus comes in its full power and starts to spread, not just in Israel, but in other countries as well. He's regarded as the king of the Jews, not just among the Jews, but among the other Gentiles, who accept him as their king. And now he becomes the King of Kings. I mean, how much more of a public victory do you want? I mean, the king has had his public victory. The work continues, of course, to this day, and Jesus is still getting that harvest. He's still getting this massive, blessed harvest through his disciples. So really, the king had his public victory. After his ascension and up to the present day, the kingdom of God has been made manifest. It was a secret in the time of Jesus, but now it is here. It is plainly here. And millions of people on this planet will tell you that. So that is the kingdom symbolized by the sower. What will Jesus do about his failing kingdom? That was the question we asked. What will Jesus do about things looking as bad as they are? Well, the answer is he will keep doing what he is doing because he knows what he's doing. This is all going according to plan. It may look like he's a crazy farmer. It may look like he doesn't know anything about agriculture or, in the case of literalism, evangelism. But Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. He knows the results he's going to have. Jesus told his disciples that when it comes to spiritual understanding, to him who has, more will be given. And to those who understand Jesus, to them has been given a secret. Okay, right? That gospel has been fully revealed, and Jesus' victory is going to come through them. That's the idea. That's the plan that Jesus has going here. And that is how this failing kingdom is going to become the great kingdom of God. And that is my point here in the secret of the sower. So let's summarize all of that, and we'll take questions afterward. So first of all, first point, the surprising success of the sower. I said that the main plot of this parable is that the sower seems to be a complete fool, and yet surprisingly, he is a tremendous success. He is blessed by God in his efforts, even though they look silly. The second point was the secret identity of the sower, and I refer to the sower's secret identity because I think Jesus himself does some things to keep it a secret. He doesn't actually tell you who the sower is and kind of misdirects you, if I understand the parable correctly. At least the way people read it, you're misdirected. And that said, I think Jesus himself is the sower, and I gave you 5 arguments for that. And that really is the linchpin of my whole message. So if you didn't agree with me, sorry. The kingdom symbolized by the sower was the third point. What is the kingdom like? Well, the king looks like a failed king. However, the king actually did succeed in his agenda, which was to reveal and conceal himself at the same time. And then eventually, after that time of revealing and concealing, through the disciples, the kingdom becomes fully known, and the king has his public victory. And that is how I would talk about the sower in the parable of the sower. Now, we still have to discuss those soils and those kinds of seed and those kinds of crops that come up, and that is going to be the theme of my next message when we get there. So that's for next time. And right now I want to open up for questions or comments on any of this.